Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Anyway, so what I'm going to be talking about today is trust and cute machines, attractive machines, all kinds of machines that make us want to like them, trust them. And it's really, this entire talk is in a way a question for you all, and mainly a provocation to get the conversation going. Because I think it's one of the biggest things we're facing now is the rise of machines that in various ways we cannot distinguish from not necessarily intelligent humans, but sentient beings of different kinds. And this has been sort of at the heart of AI since the very beginning. In 1950, Alan Turing wrote a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, in which this is a very famous paper, you're all familiar with what's called now the Turing test, in which he posited what was essentially a game of deception, where his take on the question, can a machine think? He said, it's too vague. There's no way to answer that. And he said, if instead we could have machines where if you play this form of a parlor game, you can't distinguish the machine from the human, that at that behavior level is what we should care about, or it's at least what we can care about. And if they become indistinguishable, we'll have to just think of them as intelligent. And following up on that, the game ELIZA was created by MIT professor Joseph Weizenbaum. And ELIZA is, as probably many of you know, an online psychotherapist. But Weizenbaum was not making the psychotherapist to prove that you could do this he was doing it to prove that you could do it easily. But his point was that you could do it so easily. You could make a machine that, this is in 1964, so this is a very primitive computer program that basically it was framed as a Rogerian psychologist. You would type something at it, it would respond sort of as a psychologist would, and you could have this dialogue going. And his point in doing this was so that people would say, oh yes, you are right. Language, it turns out, is not really the right metric to make this measurement into whether something is intelligent. We should think of this as irrelevant. We've proved this point. But instead, it quite backfired on him. And people, for instance, first his secretary insisted he leave the room when he was corresponding with it, because she said, I'm having a private conversation. Please stay away. People loved this psychiatrist. They liked talking to it. They liked this interaction. He was so horrified, he never did any more computer programming. Spent the rest of his career, he wrote a very interesting book that's still quite prescient called Computer Power and Human Reason, in which he warned about the sort of coming apocalypse of a world in which computers became more important and they were all being built by people with no social skills. But anyway, but if we go fast forward now, this notion of a computer psychologist is still very active. I recently gave a paper to a presentation about this to the annual meeting of the Psychoanalysts Association, which it was fascinating because I usually talk to tech audiences. You're all sitting out there, you're all typing, and everything's a very different feeling when you look into a room of 90 psychoanalysts because they listen very, very carefully. Oh, wow, I've never had an audience that just listened so well. It was a little intimidating. So the morning was like a couple of people speaking. In the afternoon, they all watched Her together, all the sex scenes from Her, and discussed it, which is fascinating. But this is, this was another slide I talked to you about them. This is like now we're doing somewhat more intricate online psychoanalysts. The ELIZA program was based on the Rogerian model where they just sort of answer you back by turning your questions around. It's not the most sophisticated one, but now they're building sort of CBT-based psychotherapy programs. There's a very good side of it. A lot of people who could use therapy cannot afford, they're in rural regions. So a lot of the questions I'm asking here is it's very easy to say, this is horrible, this is scary, but here it's looking at you, here's the part of the slide. On this side is showing the vision system behind it. Is there, there's also a very good side. These can be really, really helpful interventions. So a lot of the question here, and the other side is, if you're sitting in a room paying a psychoanalyst $200 to listen to you, what are they really thinking? You know, what is the value of it actually being a human being? What if that human being is actually sitting there thinking, oh my God, this is the most boring, self-absorbed person ever. I can't stand them. You know, if that's what the psychoanalyst is actually thinking, though they've been well trained to hide it, maybe, you know, are you better off with just something that can algorithmically correspond to you and say something useful? What is it? For if we're going to say we really want that human relationship, what is it that we care about in it? And so that's the main provocation I want to think about today is, to the extent that we can look at some of these machines and say, oh, we want the real thing, we want the real human, we want the real sentient being, let's think more deeply about why we want that. So this is sort of, because I think this notion of what's between being human and proving that you're human, knowing what's a robot, is sort of like the key test that we're going to be dealing with in the 21st century, and why do we care? Just another way of thinking about this issue of why we care is we are surrounded every day, we're used to dealing with people in a service economy. That's a lot of, you know, how many of you have worked as a waitress? Or in some other service job where your job was about faking an emotion you did not feel. I don't go to a restaurant thinking, I really, really want to know what you're thinking of me, which might be like, oh, a table full of like 3 50-year-old ladies, like they never tip. Well, I hate them. But what I really get is, why, what a wonderful choice. We live in a world where an enormous number of our interactions are not actually all that straightforward. And would we particularly want to live in the world where they are? And I think these are the frameworks we want to think about behind these robots. This is Paro. It's being developed. It's a robot seal that kind of purrs and responds. It doesn't have words, but it's like a stuffed animal, but much more responsive. It can curl up around you, etc. So it feels much more like the affection of a living being. When they were first introduced, they were introduced as a children's toy, and there was a lot of nervousness around that. People didn't like that. But now they're being used, they're put out by a Japanese company, and the idea is that they're being used in nursing homes where you have these elderly patients with dementia. It's found that if there's an animal around, they do much better, but they're completely incapable of taking care of an actual animal. So what are the ethics behind using something like Paro in this situation where you are truly faking someone? They may well think that this is a living being that they're responding to. It helps them, it helps settle them down and everything. It's fake, it's not, but an animal wouldn't necessarily benefit by being held by this person. And I think a lot of the questions here, for instance, with artificial animals, really force us to think about our relationships with pets and animals in general. Are we, by moving into a world where the animal where is taken care of is fake, is this a wasting of human emotion? Are we wasting affection? Are we learning to lavish affection on a creature that doesn't benefit from it? Or is this a kindness? What if you have a 3-year-old who tends to pull the cat's tail? Is it better that he have an artificial pet? So when, again, do we care about what's real and where the benefit is? The Tamagotchi is like sort of a very early artificial pet. For those, these were, for one, they're a really interesting note on how easy it is to really, really care about the life of a non-living thing. Because basically the Tamagotchi was this little pocket pet that you had to pay a lot of attention to. You had to click its little button to feed it, to clean its little environment, etc. And if you didn't do this, this is also the difference between the Japanese and the American version. In the Japanese version, it would die and it would not come back to life. The American version, we don't really deal with unhappy endings that well, so they would eventually come back to life. But it would eventually die. Now, some of the interesting pieces here are you teaching kids that, things that really die, it's all just a game, haha, you'll just get another one, or are you actually teaching responsibility with it? If you have a child that's sitting at, your Thanksgiving, grandma's here, you have this kid who has to get up every 3 minutes to go feed their Tamagotchi, on the one hand, are you saying, here's this game that has found a way to just move itself into every dimension of life, and this is a horrible disruption, and I don't care if your game dies. You have actual human beings here at the table that you should be paying attention to. It's ridiculous that you're privileging this artificial being over them. Or are you saying, I can't give this child this message because this is like a training ground and I want them to be responsible. I don't want them to think, oh, well, let's not feed the chicks and, okay, they'll die, but I wanted to go on vacation. That this is like a training ground for caring about a living thing. So a lot of it is the framework in which we put these creatures to understand what kind of lesson we're trying to draw from them. And as you know, we have a long history of manufacturing things to be cute, and it's something that this kind of the sort of neonatal look. So we've had a lot of toys. It's not like adding robotics changes these things. We don't get freaked out usually when a child loves a teddy bear. And part of the difference with the intelligence, though, is that line of how fake is it? Because with the teddy bear, once you're beyond the age of 3, where the entire world is sort of a weird psychedelic trip, I think, for the experience of the child, as they get older, you understand the difference between a doll and a real person, or between a stuffed animal and a real one, and that a lot of it is about a game of imagination, that at some level the child knows. It's about building imagination, which it's hard to know where Paro falls in, but as you get animals that are increasingly designed to be interactive, when we add the intelligence and the interactivity, where that imagination comes in is a little bit different, and where the belief that there's actual sentience in that thing is different, and understanding the effects of that is an enormous question now, and that's part of one of the questions I want to throw out to you all for discussion is, what is the change when the intelligence and the interaction is coming from the creature, from the physical thing itself, and it's not something that's coming fully from the child's imagination. Just on the level of cuteness, this is a cat. I really like cats, but if you look at them, we have effectively evolved. If you look at the difference between a lion and a cat, a lot of it is that the cat over time has evolved to have these cute features, this roundness, this interaction. There's great work that's been done with wolves and dogs. There's a Russian experiment that, if you haven't heard of it, it's fascinating. They tried to breed wolves to be nicer. Just what happens if you keep breeding the nicest ones? It turns out that if you keep breeding them for personality, they also end up having neonatal faces. And so they ended up with bigger eyes and smaller chins and everything. It's been done with wolves and with foxes. That kind of cuteness certainly has been used by marketers for a long time, and it's very, very disarming. Again, here is a machine that's been marketed as being cute. It's not an intelligent machine, but it's certainly been very effective at the marketing level. But now we're moving into the world where this is Jibo that is being marketed as sort of a personal lifestyle assistant that will live in your house. But it's a listening machine, but it's a very disarming listening machine because, as I said last night, a lot of that cuteness is something that we have evolved to be disarmed by. Babies are not all that nice, but if we didn't like babies as a species, we wouldn't last very long. So we have at a very, very deep level an affection for things that have big eyes, little button noses, that kind of little chin. So what we're dealing with now are machines that, instead of using words to help us, to train us to react to them in a particular way, use this kind of neonatal look. And so when you look at something like this, it brings out, it's every trick that you can do to say, trust me, I am innocent. There's excellent work that's done by a psychologist named Deborah Zieberwitz at Brandeis, where she has looked at what she calls the overgeneralization of the baby face effect. And she looks at it, for instance, in court, like how much just having to have the facial structure of a baby will make you be seen as much more innocent, in particular in court cases, et cetera. We've already mentioned today Hello Barbie, but Hello Barbie also as a listening machine, as just mentioned earlier, is recording a lot of children's voices. So here, one of the trust issues is you have this kind of trustworthy looking being who you are confiding all kinds of things to, but it's taking those words and moving them somewhere else. And then this is, I think, why Kate invited me back to give this talk, is because at our previous talk, I said these are the deep sea anglerfish of technology. And this is an anglerfish is a creature that has evolved to have something that looks like a small, delicious treat at the end of a little spine that it has. And so it attracts other animals with its own little angler, and then it comes and eats them. And so I think there's a level where if you make something that's disarming and cute enough in order to get you to interact in a particular way, in order to gather your words and use them elsewhere, at what point does this go from being a very, very helpful assistant to being a computational anglerfish? And just a couple more quick examples of some of the things we want to think about in terms of trust. This is work that was done obviously several elections ago by Jeremy Bailenson, but what he was interested in is how if you take a person's face and you morph it with, for instance, a presidential candidate, so that you can ask them what they think of the candidate when they're looking at a picture of the candidate as themselves. But when you take a morph of the candidate's face and the person's own face, people don't necessarily notice that their own face has been morphed into the candidate's face. But they then find the candidate much more trustworthy. We tend to trust people who look like us. So when he was doing this, it was very interesting, but the types of technologies that we have now hadn't permeated the population to quite the extent they do now. But just think of it, given that almost all of the messages that we receive, for instance, from politicians, are targeted, it's very easy for them to be targeted with something like this that says, not only with the words they use so that they can target your words to things you're interested in, but even target how they appear so that you will find them much more trustworthy. So our understanding of what are the things that we need to think about in terms of how we perceive the world, how we perceive trust, are growing. And this is just something because I thought you should see it. This make your next trophy wife 100% titanium. Just to remember, it's not simply cuteness that is disarming, but sexiness that's disarming, as came up recently with Ashley Madison, when it turned out that most of the people who actually wanted to have a tryst with married you were actually machines. And so I'd like to leave you with a quote from Harry Potter, which is, "Ginny," said Mr. Weasley, flabbergasted, "haven't I taught you anything? What have I always told you? Never trust anything that can think for yourself if you can't see where it keeps its brain." Thank you.
Thank you so much, and to the computational anglerfish. We're coming up on time. I'm really sensitive to the fact that meals are important, but there is so much to talk about here that what I'm going to suggest is that we move in to start eating delicious things and continue to ask questions of Judith, of Suresh, of Tim, of Dennis, of everybody on this panel, and continue the conversation while we eat. Thank you so much. If you could thank all the panelists, that would be grand.